We're now live.
Thank you, Augie.
Board meeting.
I want to welcome everyone who's here tonight. This is a special work session of the Board of Trustees on the 10th of March, 2021. Tonight, we're going to hear from the Village Justice Court and from the Building Department. Is there a motion to open the meeting, please?
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And I'll just let everyone know that Mayor Murphy is not able to attend tonight, so he will not be here. Go ahead, Nora. What?
I had also sent an email. The Arts Council has asked for us to approve their donation of a bench in honor of Mary Louise Cox, and they got the paperwork in today. They didn't realize they had to do it, so I'm wondering if we can just add that at the end.
Sure, I have no problem. Does anyone else have a problem with that?
No.
I'll
Great.
remind. Okay.
Please remind us, Nora, because I have a feeling we'll forget.
Yeah.
Okay. Is Jerry here?
I'm here, but I broke the connection on my camera, so I'm here.
Okay. Do you have a preference who goes first, or is there a plan tonight?
Well, I would prefer that the judges go first.
Judges,
Although I don't think they're billing us by the hour. They are billing by the hour kind of people, so I want to get them out of here.
are you prepared to go first, judges? Is that
Yeah.
fine?
We're ready to go, and I'm happy to start out. And Christy,
Can I ask for one? It looks like Bonnie might be signed in as an attendee, so we may have to promote her. The 7710 number is coming up on the attendee list.
Yeah, that's the court.
yeah, if I think that Bonnie and Alita are both we're going to join. So
Okay. I only see the 7710 number. The other two attendees are members of the Budget Committee who can ask questions kind of towards the end of your presentation. Okay.
that's fine. So the 7710 number is probably Bonnie, and it's probably Alita together. It's on mute now. Could you just confirm that you're on, Bonnie and Alita? You have to unmute though.
Yes, it's Bonnie and Alita.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining us. So Kelly, I'm happy to start out and with some brief remarks, and then we can turn to the actual PowerPoint that we have put together, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
Okay, so thank you, members of the board, for having us in tonight and this afternoon. So we have Judge Christy Derrico is on, as well as myself, Judge Dan Gallagher, and we have our Chief Clerk, Bonnie Castorella, and our newest addition, Alita Losi. I'm sorry. Alita just started last week. She is our new court clerk, and we are happy that she graduated from Greenberg's Town Court to join us and fill in, and she has been a great addition so far. So welcome, Alita. I'm going to start out with some brief oversight or some general summary observations about court this past year, and then I'll turn it over to Judge Derrico to review the presentation. I think we could all say that it's almost become routine to point out how challenging the past year has been for everybody, and it certainly has been the case for the court. But the challenge would have existed for the court even if the pandemic hadn't descended upon us. Before the court shut down about a year ago, we were very much immersed in adjusting our operations in response to some complex and recently enacted, and I would say monumental legislation that came out of Albany that extensively impacted criminal and landlord-tenant practice. And a lot of work had to be done for that. And then as we were getting comfortable with that, the COVID crisis came, and the state, the courts around the state, including the Village of Mary Court, were closed to the public, large part starting last March. So, but we think the court quickly adjusted to the new reality by taking a bunch of steps, including having moved mostly or almost all of our in-person criminal and other actions to the Microsoft Teams virtual platform. So court continued, even though court offices were closed to the public. We have continued. Our staff has been working, and frankly, in some respects, they've been working harder during COVID, even though the offices were closed to the public. There's a lot of complexities associated with trying to operate a court when the people can't knock on the door and come up and talk to you. We made communications with the public more robust by promoting the public's option to submit email inquiries that our staff fielded regularly. We set up secure VPN access to the court staff to enable work from home during the office closures that we experienced. We instituted pleas by mail for traffic and other minor violations to avoid the need for in-person appearances. That was something that the court system approved during the crisis, and we jumped on it, and it has allowed us to really keep the paper moving while being in a position of being shut down. We also opened up the first floor payment and information window. As you enter the courthouse, you see the window there, and we're providing information, payment options, and limited access to the public while the rest of the court's offices remain closed to the public. So we did all this while experiencing prolonged staffing vacancies following the retirement of Louise Dunaway and the departure for another job of another court clerk. So for the majority of calendar 2020, we were functioning at half staff, half of our full-time staff. So our ability to successfully adjust to the challenges that came from the constantly evolving legislative and regulatory changes that were imposed on the court by the legislature, the governor, and the New York court system, I think it really reflects the commitment and dedication of our staff, the court staff. And so we thank them, and we'd also like to pay special recognition to Bonnie Castorella, who assumed the chief court clerk position during the COVID crisis. And we really think that she has risen to the occasion and the challenge, and we really appreciate it, her work. And finally, just like to thank Bonnie and Alita for helping us put together today's presentation. So with that sort of overview, I'll just turn to Christy for for a review of the PowerPoint.
Okay, and we'll save questions to the end. If there's something pressing, you can let me know. Dan Sarnoff's offered to run the slide. So you can switch to the next page, please. And thank you to the board for allowing us to give this presentation. And thank you to our staff for their help in this PowerPoint presentation. Pandemic has made all of us get up to speed with programs and plans we weren't previously familiar with. And they really did a great job in assisting us. Okay, page 1. This is an overview of everything the court does. Some board members have heard this before, others have not. We do things you might expect with parking fines and penalties, vehicle and traffic, but we'd like to bring to your attention that if a crime happens in the village, that defendant gets arraigned with us in the village before the case goes anywhere, okay? Justice courts like ours are the largest trial court level in New York State. They're the busiest, they handle the most cases, and they're the court of first impression for the community, because this is the court that people interact with local events. Next slide, please. Okay, as Judge Gallagher pointed out, the court operations during COVID-19 involved a closure for a period of time. And just to let you know, there were briefly periods of countywide arraignments at a district level where a county judge or a city judge would sit in on a case and do the arraignment. This was a brief period of time. It wasn't an easy situation. And it seemed like the system was very anxious to move back to our court handling our own cases. But by executive order, there was a period of time that took place. We remained open the entire time. There were periods where by executive order, we were still doing things in person. This slowly shut down. We were entirely virtual, and now we're gearing up again. We've had in excess of 10 executive orders from our administrative judge. As you can imagine, these are multi-page documents that we have to read through, see what's changed, what stayed the same, what we have to debrief our staff on. It's been really stressful, and this falls on the heels of the changes that Judge Gallagher explained to you that took place over the past prior to 2020 with bail reform and landlord-tenant reform. We have been constantly educating and re-educating ourselves on what the new operations are. Obviously, so on Tuesday, we handle code violations, vehicle and traffic law matters, civil matters, and prior to the pandemic, we might handle anywhere from 75 to 100 cases. On Thursdays, we call that our criminal day, and prior to handle up to 100 cases. Obviously, as all of you are aware, the pandemic has seen a decrease in volume, but I want to take this opportunity to point out you've been given the police department's numbers for 2018, 19, and 20. And what I found interesting in looking at these numbers, the number of calls to the police department did not diminish. They're still in excess of 14,000. And although the arrests for 2020 were below 300, historically, I looked back to the numbers from 2007 to 2010, and this is not a linear situation or something that takes a steep dive on a pandemic. Things go up and down all the time. In 2008, there were 480 arrests, and in 2009, there were almost 600. So these things go up and down. And based upon the fact that the number of calls into the police department is over 14,000, which did not decline in the pandemic, we are seeing things gearing up already. And we anticipate they will get back to levels that they were prior to this emergency situation. I would like to also note domestic violence incidents were almost 200, which was in the pandemic an increase of several cases from the prior year's numbers. But that just shows you our community has a need, and the court needs to be ready to assist in those types of cases. Okay, so next slide. So we've highlighted some accomplishments. We've operated for the past 25 years with the same staffing. I don't think we need to delve into this again. We've discussed staffing issues over and over. In our opinion, our staff works incredibly hard. They work on 2 different levels in multiple different rooms, having to man many windows, and it's tiring, and they do a really good job, and we appreciate them for that. Again, we transitioned to virtual operations. I will note we were able to get a laptop at no expense to the village from OCA, so both judges have a laptop, and that allows us to handle matters quickly when we're called upon with the police department. Years ago, when I first became a judge, which is now 10 years the clerk reminded me that it was the mantra of our predecessors to say, Judge, you have 72 hours for an arraignment. Let me tell you right now, there would never be a time that we would have 72 hours to arraign a defendant. We are responsive, and we are now required, what's required for an arraignment is onerous. Every defendant needs an attorney, even if it's a violation level. There's also language barriers that we have to accommodate. So we use our computer to get these things done as quickly as possible, which I think is advantageous for everyone involved, including the defendant. No one's rights are being trampled upon, but certainly there's no reason for anyone to have downtime when it's unnecessary. Okay. Next. Okay, so accomplishments continued. We also implemented the first plea by mail protocol in the county, which was the prototype used for other jurisdictions. Some of this, as many of you are business people or worked in municipalities for years, it seems you might come up with an idea and say, why can't we just do this? Let's get it done. The courts are always governed by a very stringent ethical environment. Everything we do is supervised by ethics board and by our administrative judge. So just this issue of implementing the plea by mail was a multi-week / month multiple revision process just to get to the point that we have had operational forms. We can't just come up with an idea and implement it without making sure everyone's, all the necessary issues have been reviewed and they're legal. That's what we are sometimes hampered with, but justice is not a business. It is something that has laws and rules that we have to follow. We did implement N-Court. N-Court is an online payment platform. We can use it for multiple situations, not just payments of fines, but we can also use it for violation level matters and things of that situation. So this has really helped us to keep the court open during the pandemic. And I just want people to consider that when a person has a ticket or a person has a legal matter, they often want to resolve the payment process as well. This is not a situation for the court just to get in revenue. It's to help constituents or defendants resolve a matter, do what they have to do, and move on so they don't accidentally forget about it and have a situation in the future. So we have found that this N-Court has been extremely helpful. Next slide. Moving forward, we are already gearing up for the court's reopening. We've reinstituted Tuesday court as well as Thursday court. And going back to the numbers, my Thursday court, and I believe Judge Gallagher, we're definitely up to an excess of 50 cases on those days. So it's already starting to return to the levels that they were before. Things that we are planning on meeting on and implementing as soon as we're done with the budget review, deal with cross-training of all staff. I think the pandemic has shown us someone could get sick, someone could have an injury. We always have to make sure we have redundancy in the process, especially because the court has very serious systems that we have to monitor, including bookkeeping, the bail account, defendants' cases. So we have to make sure that each employee can do the other person's job and that it's done seamlessly. We'll continue to apply for grants. I will point out the first floor window was paid for in large part, if not entirely, by a grant from OCA. The carpeting in the courtroom, the chairs, our computers, we're constantly applying for funds when we can. And we do have future projects that we'd like to implement. One is potentially microfiching our files. The attic, which I don't know if everyone in front of me has had the wonderful opportunity of viewing the attic. I'm afraid if our code enforcement went up there, they might violate our building, but we have to have a revolving system where we have to shred documents, again, under certain protocols. And we look for funding to assist us with that or use county shredding services. So that's a situation we have to get back to. It's like mold. It doesn't go away. It keeps growing. So the shredding is an ongoing process. But we definitely want to look towards technology. And now that we are nearing full staff, we're hopeful that we can do that and how we can make the system move and function better with technology. Next slide. 2018 revenues and summonses. My understanding, this is the last year that the comptroller has data on. So what we're going to discuss moving after 2018 was compiled by Bonnie Castorella, which we really thank her for, but we knew the board wanted to see the numbers. So this speaks for itself. You can see the numbers of tickets issued. You can see the total of collected revenues. Okay, and then we move to 2019. Again, you can see those numbers and the total line item. And these were compiled using all of the various information. And I will add that the comptroller uses calendar year data and the village uses a fiscal year. So it's slightly different. But I think you're used to reading budgets and you can see what that means. So if we could flip again. So then we go to 2020. We did our best to give you a projection for the year. Again, we feel that these numbers, we were able to serve the public by keeping the N-Court open for payments, which was helpful to them. But as we'll get to later on, we will look at the court's budget and what it costs to run the court. But if the revenues were down maybe about 50%, so were the expenses. So it seems to be tracking, and I think again, that speaks for itself. Moving to the next page, page 10. This is interesting to show you of the summonses issued, which are parking and which are other summonses. But in the revenues column, this is pure data. 60% is other and 40% are parking. Again, this is for you to assess and deal with as the fiscal agency for the village. We just report the information. Turning to the next page, going to rankings. The most recent year we have is again 2018. We have no reason to believe that we're not in a similar standing because all courts were similarly affected. We all were closed at the same time. And we'll see what the numbers are when they publish them, but we are one of the higher ranking courts in the state and the county. We're always up there, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. It's moves up and down, but it's all within that range. The next page shows you on page 12 how the village compares to the other municipalities that are of similar standing. Okay, and we use the revenue as a barometer, but that's just how the state does the rankings. That's not how the court views itself. Revenues are just a data line for us. It doesn't impact how we serve the public. Okay, the next page. This shows the revenue distribution and what's retained by the village and what goes to New York State and the county. Again, that's pretty clear and speaks for itself. Moving to page 14. This is our current staffing. There's 2 judges, 2 head clerks, one being the chief clerk, Bonnie Castarella. Then we have the assistant court clerk and a cashier. We also note that we have a large Spanish-speaking population amongst other languages. And so we have 2 Spanish speakers, and Ms. Loki, our most recent addition to the staff, speaks, I think, 1 or 2 other languages. So she's multilingual, and that is helpful. But you do have to bear in mind that when we're dealing with a court case, we can't have court staff interpret in a court matter because you have to have an independent court-approved intermediary to do the interpretation of the process. So even though we have this is just to facilitate things such as the window and so forth, but we can't rely upon it to interpret during a criminal proceeding. I will take the moment here. I think there was an oversight in the budget. It has Louise Dunaway still in the budget instead of Alita, who was recently added, so that you can see how that could happen. But it's empty. So we need to have her salary put in there. And I think that was just an oversight because she was such a recent hire. But I'm noting that for the board that the budget does not include a salary line for that employee, and it needs to. And then I think I leave this to Augie as far as it shows longevity. It still has Louise. That doesn't apply. And he going forward, since that staff member wouldn't have that longevity. So you can handle that. So there needs to be a couple of additions and subtractions there. Okay. Going to the next page, 15. So this was with a lot of hard work with the staff. And I think this is one of the more important pages, looking at the combined annual salaries and longevity for the 4 full-time court staff members. You see the adopted budget, the current salaries and longevity, and the difference, which is a 7.6% reduction. And then we looked at all of the justice court expenses. We were flat, basically, within a couple percentages for a number of years. And then due to some changes that took place, I guess, the budget did go up, but it appears that it's going back to a budget that will be in keeping with past history. We haven't really been a department that comes in and asks for a 30% increase. We try to be as economical as possible and to get supplies and resources wherever we can at no cost to the village. And I think we can see here that the difference between the adopted and the actual, it's basically 50%. So we feel that we've pulled our weight. Judge Gallagher and I, our salaries are posted for the record. They're modest and we work well beyond a part-time job or job sharing, however you want to look at it. And I will also note that this budget, the $569,414, that includes this ComPlus amount that is mandatory. That's who you've hired. It's now, I think, Passport is the name. That's who you hired to do the traffic tickets, the parking tickets. So that's something that is outside of our budget, and it's just a contract the village negotiated for that, which I will note it's made it easier. We don't want to be entering handwritten tickets. Those have errors, and I think this is a better system, but that large number is part of our budget. The last page shows the organizational chart within our department. I think some other things I wanted to mention, Judge Gallagher mentioned that we just recently reopened the window, which is wonderful. People will be lining up at our doors. They want to resolve these issues. So it's really important that we have that resource available. We're open 10 to 1 right now, Monday to Friday. I think it's gone well. We can accept payments, give information. And we've given you memos in the past on the changes in the law. There was a change in bail reform. They did add some offenses to things we can set bail on, but by and large, bail is greatly reduced as an option for defendants unless it's a serious violent crime or things of that nature, certain domestics. Finally, I wanted to add, we've heard that there's some discussions about moving certain departments, and we would request that we be kept in that conversation. It's difficult for us to run the court, a window on the first floor, and then our offices on the second floor. Maybe we could meet together and find a better way to organize these offices. But we'd like to ask that we be included in that conversation, not just an afterthought. We've really worked hard to provide our staff with a pleasant place to work. When I first came into the job, it was dark. There was no kitchen facilities, no water, and the bathrooms are terrible. I will add that. I think that that's something that needs, the women's room in particular. Well, that's the only one I could speak of personally, but I think that that should be looked at for staff at 169 for the entire building. But I think that we've made our offices very pleasant. Our staff we broke through the wall between the chief clerk's office and the main office, so now we can work together freely. Everyone's door is open all the time. There's a free flow of information, and if someone has a question, we work together, and I think it's a pleasant place that's working hard for the village.
So I guess the only thing I would add is just general issues. You should be aware that the roof over the courtroom is in major need of repair. It ices over, it fills up with water. We're concerned that it will leak or collapse. And the courtroom windows and the safety doors in the courtroom, those are perpetually requested to be updated. And we just throw those out there as things that are more capital projects. But I guess at this point, you know, other than just pointing out the salary issue with Alita being put in as a line item, I've looked over the budget. It looks pretty much fine. I mean, we're pretty much flat, except for salaries. They go up and down. And so we'd like to open this up to any questions that, you know, the board may have for the court.
All right. Do any trustees have questions?
I guess,
Dan, I have a question if I can. Dan, you said the roof, that you're concerned about the roof over the court. Is this something new, or has it always been that way?
The roof, after every rainstorm, it collects a couple of inches of water that just sits there until it evaporates. And this winter there was, sizable amounts of snow up there, which obviously you can't do much about, but there's no drainage, and we're just concerned that, that leaks are gonna follow, and, the structural integrity might be in question. So it's just a reminder. It's not the first time we pointed this out.
It's a flat roof, Dan. So you can see it when you come up the stairs from the first floor. If you look to your right, you can look right out the window over the courtroom roof. And as a flat roof, and you and your line of work, they tend to collect water.
Yeah.
Painfully, I'm aware of it.
Yes. Don't design flat roof.
Nora, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it was just an error that we didn't have the Alita Lucy's salary in.
What do you mean, Nora? An error?
Well, that there's no line for the employee that we've just hired.
Oh, so it has to be redone because Alita was hired, I think her first day was March 5th.
So I think it's just, it's not.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we'll make that adjustment. I didn't even think of it until the judges mentioned it just now. Just an oversight.
Victor, do you have anything?
No, I was just going to ask the same question when we'll just bring it back to us with that small revision. I don't have anything further.
Yeah.
I have a question. I just wonder if things like the end court and some of the things that have been happening, like the online arraignments, do you anticipate that those might stick around post-COVID emergency?
We're hoping. We obviously, as I've addressed, the judicial system can be cumbersome.
Yeah.
And the tail often, wags the dog in some ways, but we are at the mercy of the decisions from higher up. We have expressed our desire to keep the virtual arraignments. We will have to go back to in-person court. There are ethics opinions. They strongly encourage us to give people the right to see a judge in numerous situations. And you can imagine that. Imagine getting a letter and being told that you're not allowed to see the judge. It's very off-putting and might encourage you to plead guilty to something when that wasn't what you wanted to do. So we're hoping that we could keep some of these things. I will say to you that we meet multiple times a year to revisit how things are done, to make it more efficient. And I'm actually hopeful that some of these abrupt changes that COVID brought will give us the freedom to maybe make things a little bit easier. It would be wonderful if we could microfiche our files. You should see how they're kept. It's an old-fashioned big file that gets dog-eared. Why on earth can't we have this on an iPad that we could flip through and type up some notes? But this is in the future, and I think if it did happen, it would involve statewide and funding and so forth, because that would be beyond our capability to do that locally. But we're going to meet and revisit the practices, and I think we've just gotten more and more efficient.
Yeah, just so you know, the question's interesting for people that don't deal with this on a daily basis. When we get a call at 9 o'clock at night, they have somebody that's been, arrested, charged with assault 3, which is a misdemeanor charge. In the old days, we had to find a lawyer to come into the courtroom and be there to represent the individual. We also had to find an interpreter to come in and participate, and that caused delays. Right now, we can get this all together in the course of an hour, which makes it easier for us. It makes it easier for the police who don't have to hold somebody as long. It makes it easier for the defense attorneys who might have to otherwise, get out in the middle of the night. So it is an efficiency that we hope will continue, at least as far as arraignments go. But as Christy said, we're really subject to what the court system tells us we'll be able to do. But we hope that we will learn from this pandemic period, and we'll be able to enjoy some of the things that we have adopted during that time.
Yeah, hard as it is to say, there might be a few silver linings in this experience.
Maybe.
I just want to see if any of our budget committee members who are.
Before
Oh,
we
I'm
move
sorry,
on,
Dan.
Kelly,
I'm sorry.
I have a question for, I guess, Christy and Dan. Christy, is microfiche dictated to be done as the only way of doing it, or are other methodologies allowable?
There are other courts who have done this, not many. And I can't even say to you how successful they've been, whether they reverted. We looked at it at one point. We'd have to do it again, and it has to be with approval. The files that you maintain for the court, they could be some in perpetuity, some for 50 years. It's different than ordinary business practices. So when we get to this, we could have a meeting. Maybe the board will set a liaison to work with us, and we can give you more information. It's not something that's done a whole heck of a lot. But let's see, maybe I am seeing little things in the criminal justice system that say we may get to the fact that we can serve people with a temporary order of protection virtually is a huge advancement. You know, we had to have someone physically before us in the past. We had to get an executive order to allow these virtual proceedings. So I'm hopeful that maybe we will get, as Kelly said, some silver lining to this terrible situation.
So following up on that, Dan, in your investigation of municity or whatever it's called, is there a ability to handle the court records?
Dan Sarnoff or Dan Gallagher?
Dan, excuse me, we have 3 days here.
Well, Municity, no. As far as Laserfish, I hate to punt, but I don't know if Augie may can speak more eloquently.
I guess the key question is what is the media that the court system wants? Is the media Laserfish, which is PDF, or is it what Dan Natchez asked earlier? What media does the court want?
Yeah.
Microfiche, or can it be in PDF?
Yeah, and to a certain extent, that's the issue, is that the court, to a certain extent, serves a different master than we do. We're under New York State, they have to comply with the OCA guidelines. So it's a little different.
I understand that, but what I was trying to suggest, I didn't know if the court was aware of it, but we are facing a major upgrade in software and have been going back and forth over the last couple of years down different paths. And that's going to be a significant expenditure. And the question is, should, maybe there some forethought on this and trying to move forward is to try and have some conversations with you all.
I would
like now, not as opposed to a year from now, because if we're going to make an investment, which is going to be before the board at another meeting, then the question is trying to do this all at once rather than doing one for one, one for another, and then it just, all you're doing is spending more and more money without getting, any efficiency.
I'd be happy to see if we could work out a liaison with the village as well as with OCA to see if we can coordinate this in a way that makes sense for the village.
So can I ask Augie and Dan to coordinate with the court, ASAP? Not that you have anything else to do, but to try and get the ball rolling so we know what direction we might be able to go, not necessarily to get the answer, but to know, if the court says, as of now, you can only do A, period, then that limits us to that. If there's flexibility, it might. Then the question is, can we work that into whatever else we have to do for the village, for the rest of the village?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, Kelly, that's all.
Thanks, Dan N. I see that Glenn has a question from the Budget Committee.
Good evening. First of all, Dan and Christy, I'd like to thank you for the fine job you do in the village. I personally haven't been able to observe you at work, but some of my more disreputable friends say nice things about you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of quick ones. At this time, are you completely caught up with your cases? There's no backlog caused by the corona, or you think that you're completely caught up?
You want to go with that, Dan, or?
Well, I'll give you my input. On the criminal side, we've been on top of this all along. There's no question that we're on top of it, and we are on schedule. There's no backlog there. In terms of parking and traffic, we understand there's been a substantial drop off in the ticketing, parking, both as traffic over the course of the past year as we've adjusted, and the ticketing agencies have adjusted to the coronavirus. So we have been using different techniques, including the plea by mail methodology to try and deal with some tickets that are not been paid off yet. So in the life of a traffic ticket, let's say somebody gets a speeding ticket, what happens is they'll either plead guilty and then we assign a fine, or they plead not guilty and we have to schedule an appearance. Well, we haven't been permitted to have appearances. So the reason the plea by mail works out so well is because our village prosecutor can look at all these traffic cases and say, you know what, I've looked at this guy's driving history, et cetera, and I'm going to give him a reduced plea if he wants to take it. And we found that we're processing a lot of traffic tickets that way. So there is a backlog. I don't believe it's substantial, but we are working on that. The same thing with parking.
And do you find that the general public is enjoying the new mail system, and it's something that you feel is going to be growing?
It's a little cumbersome. I mean, I think we're hoping to always have it, but it's a little cumbersome. It kills a lot of trees also. The forms that they mandated us to use are multi-pages, and sometimes it's just easier to have someone come in, plead guilty or whatever, provide proof and have it considered, and it's resolved. It makes a lot of work for our staff. We also have not been allowed to suspend anyone on vehicle and traffic law matters. So that's kind of hampered us. We have some files just, trudging along before we can resolve it. And once the state lifts that, we can get moving. But the only thing I wanted to say is we're really efficient. There are courts that are years behind. So whatever backlog we have is solely related to the pandemic. And once they loosen the noose, we can get moving.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. I don't see other hands up, and I just want to, before we move on, I want to really thank judges for coming in tonight and presenting such an informational look at what you're doing and what your budget situation is. I appreciate it very much. Are there any last call for questions? Anyone?
I'll just say a comment. I found the slides very useful, very elaborated, very informative. So thank you and the staff for putting it together.
Yes.
Really well, much appreciated.
We deal with this stuff on a day-by-day basis, and we realize going through this process that many people really just don't know what we do on a daily basis in the courts. So that was part of the motivation on giving the details that we provided. So, thank you, and thank you to the board for your continuing support.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for the presentation, because it's very useful to know what actually goes on. And I think one other benefit of the pandemic is that we're doing these budget sessions and they're being recorded so the public can see what goes on. And I don't know whether it's possible to put that presentation on the website. The court probably doesn't have a website, but I think that'd be interesting to a lot of residents to see what goes on, especially the residents who don't interact with the court.
Thank you for sending the slides separately. They probably could be added to the agenda for today.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
All right. Thank you all. And we will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
So we will move on to the building department. Frank, are you handling this, or are you having an intro by Jerry, or are you just starting off?
I mean, I could start off. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'll tell you that. I only knew about this meeting a couple of hours ago. Thanks, Dan. But we've had challenges in the building department also because of the pandemic. And we've had an increase in phone calls since the pandemic started. So the volume of calls that come in daily really puts a crimp in our the way we operate and the way we can respond to applicants and people just calling with questions. We were completely shut down in January, quarantine, because of a few people in our department were sick. That hasn't helped. We've been following the executive orders from the state, from Cuomo, which also, you know, influences how we deal every day with the public. You know, with social distancing, that type of thing. You know, we've changed to virtual also with even our certification, our code enforcers. Our one part-time code enforcer now is getting certified virtually, which has helped. It hasn't helped me as the head of the department because, you know, it's one less person in the office, along with we have another assistant who's been ill, so that hasn't helped either. Just, you know, even restaurants, executive orders on the HVAC systems that we have to go in and check makeup air and that type of thing. It just is added to our workload. So it's been a challenge.
Yeah, one of the things I discussed with Frank today is, you know, the mission of the building department really expanded last year. You know, it went from being a department that dealt with, you know, nuisance quality of life issues to literally quality of life issues. You know, they were the ones who had to enforce things like social distancing. They were the ones who had to make determinations as to which types of businesses were essential versus non-essential. They were the ones who had to enforce that. You know, Frank mentioned the phone calls. I can attest that I was, as you know, I was working up there for the better part of 2020. I think it probably has a lot to do with more people working from home. More people are noticing things. They're calling the building department to report these things. And as Frank mentioned, when you're working an AB schedule, you know, you don't necessarily have everyone there all the time. You know, one of the things I did last year was whenever I was working up in the building department on my I guess called my in office days, I added my phone to the building department HUD group. So I would pick up the phone when no one else was able to. And I was probably answering 10 to 15 phone calls a day and relaying information out to Frank and the others. So it's been a interesting year. As Frank mentioned with the HVAC, during the phased reopening in New York that took place in May and June last year. When it came time for the gyms to reopen, they could only open if their HVAC systems met certain requirements. Uh, you know, the Department of Health couldn't do the inspections. So the county Department of Health had asked the building departments to take care of those types of inspections. So as Frank mentioned, it really, the types of work that the building department became engaged in last year really expanded. So it presented a special challenge for our inspectors and enforcers last year and ongoing. As far as, oh, go right ahead, Frank.
I started to say, I do think that when and if the AB schedule ends, it will be very helpful to have everyone back in the office where things can be delegated, that, you know, you can't do everything by yourself and you can't do it from home necessarily. So that'll help immensely once that ends.
I don't know if anyone's familiar with the actual physical space in the building department. It's bad now. It used to be a lot worse. But you know, we've done as best we can. But even still, you have a bullpen area where most of the staff works, and you know, it's hard to maintain social distance in that bullpen area when you have 5 employees who sit there. So it's presented a special challenge. And like Frank mentioned, just doing virtual inspections, even when you're doing an inspection over Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or whatever application you use, you're only seeing what the phone shows you. You can't see the breadth of everything. And like I mentioned, with all the quality of life issues, literal quality of life issues, it was, the building department took a lot of phone calls about social distancing within stores that should be closed, etc. So
Restaurants, yeah.
it was an interesting experience.
Dan, I want to jump in here with Kelly, if I can. I want to jump in here with on our Zoom this evening is Amber Novak. She is our planner. She joined us October. Amber, was it in October?
Yes, that's correct. Hi, everyone.
The office has switched to having our consulting planner from AKRF, and then being supported by Amber and Barbara Ritter, who's an office assistant. But some of the challenges that we have also uncovered while we have fairly new people in the department, in both departments. Frank is the new building inspector, and he has a couple of new part-timers, and then Amber is brand new, who joined us in October, is that we're looking for ways to make the flow of information and the process better, because we're trying to improve things. And while I wish everything could be improved, instantaneously, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And so, Amber, I want to give you just a few minutes to talk about what you believe could be some of the improvements between the planning and building department that would articulate, how some of our challenges up there in the building department as well, because it does involve them.
Sure. I am fairly new, as you described, and it's been wonderful working with Frank and with Barbara as well, who both of whom have been very, communicative and helpful in getting me up to speed and in addressing some of the difficulties that we've just discussed with COVID impacting the two departments. I think that in my experience in these past few months being here and comparing to previous experience as well, looking at process, I would just say that this COVID situation seems to have brought to light certain needs for process improvements regarding intake of the applications. I think that the past, when working in with hard copy applications exclusively, it's an easier correction to make when applicants apply in the wrong way or in an incorrect way. But when that process is not outlined clearly and the information is not disseminated publicly, and at the end of the day, we can only lead the applicant to, lead the horse to water, so to speak, in terms of what they should be submitting by posting on the website, by informing people as they call, as they navigate the process. But, given the need to operate remotely, not just for COVID's sake, but also with the consultants that we're working with, most of whom are working remotely, may continue to do so well beyond the village office going open, and ultimately require digital submissions. Even if they are meeting in person, we need to be able to share digital submissions with the public. We need to be able to share digital submissions with the planning consultants, the engineering consultants, the landscape architecture consultants that we're working with in the planning department. And these materials, applicants who have been submitting for 20 years to the village may not be aware that this is something that is needed in the workflow, partly due to COVID, partly due to just, updated workflow processes of our partners.
Is she frozen for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she'll be back.
Needs upgrades to FiOS.
I think I think she lives at the same building Jerry first lived in, so.
Yeah,
I think once the
151.
village manager moved out, they didn't care about the being sure the residents had good internet.
Like the Ghostbusters building. It's exactly like that. All right, so Frank or Dan, how do you want to run down the budget so that we can be efficient with our time?
But before you do that, could we get a rundown of the different personnel slots in each of those two departments?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the building department, we have the building inspector. Actually, we go to the first page or the 3620, Augie. Yeah, so we have
There we go.
Frank.
Okay.
Yeah, Frank is the building inspector. Dennis Drogan.
Sorry, I was connected to the VPN, and I think I just got booted off.
So we'll get back to that conversation. We're just gonna go over. Kelly, do you want Amber to continue, or do you want to run down the budget?
Let's run down the budget because we're there now. But Amber, if we could get back to you about the, electronic filings, that's where we were and that's where we lost you.
Sure, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So Frank is the building inspector. We have Dennis Drogan, who is a full-time assistant building inspector. Sean Jimison is our fire inspector. Charlotte Mountain is our code enforcement officer. I think most of you met Charlotte at least once or twice. In a good situation, not in a situation where she's issuing a violation. Kathy Guadagnolo and Matt Gansert are our office assistants in the building department. We also have a part-time code enforcement officer and a part-time assistant building inspector. The part-time assistant building inspector is Kevin Doyle, and the part-time code enforcement officer is, I can't remember his name, Frank.
Tommy Glass. Tommy Glass.
Yes, Tommy Glass. Yeah. Mr. Glass and Mr. Jimison are also full-time firefighters in the city of White Plains. So although we do get them for the allotted time, their schedules can vary slightly week to week.
Half of our staff in the building department are White Plains firefighters, so we'll never have a problem if we have a fire.
As far as the planning staff, as Amber noted, we have and Jerry Amber, who's our planner, Barbara Ritter, who's our code enforcement officer, and our planning services, especially with the planning board, are provided by AKRF. Ashley Lay from AKRF is our consulting planner. I think that pretty much talks about that stuff. I know that we are looking to add a senior office assistant up there. Jerry, I don't know if you want to talk about that now or later.
So if you look at the salaries, the totals, we are $100,000 less than we were in last year's budget in the salaries for the building department. And so what has come to light is the fact that, and I sent the primary email out earlier today, is that we need more assistance in the office aspect of it. In fact, we need a senior office assistant to run the office, but also, and Amber can jump in here now, also develop the bulletproof process of intake. And so I was hoping to utilize some of the space in this, in the budget line for salaries to be able to do that. In addition, just before we get off this page, I want to point out that in 2020, the overtime, I'm sorry, let's start with 2019. The overtime in that department in 2019 was $53,800. In 2020's budget, it was $32,349. Last year, this budget that we're currently in, we budgeted 9,000. So far, we spent under $3,000 in overtime. So some of the information that I shared with you earlier today was because overtime was completely out of control and completely out of our control. And it is now managed much, much, much better, thanks to Frank and Dan and the process that we put in place. We do issue overtime and we do permit employees to work overtime, but we do not permit employees to choose all the overtime that they want. So, Kelly, if I could, Amber, we should talk about the role of a senior office assistant, the way we've spoken about it, and talk to the board a little bit about it.
Sure, yes, and my earlier conversation was simply to lead up to this point, which was that, and if I can share my screen, I have just a document that's a process timeline or flow chart that I can share. All of this is just to say that there's a lot of administrative work that goes into the preparation of these applications before a board, and that, you know, ultimately there are some more administrative tasks and vetting that can be done or you know, before it gets to Frank, so that when he and I are in the intake meeting with our planning consultant, we're not at a stage where there's no applicant contact information or there's no email address to send it to. If an applicant is submitting an application and there's a space on the building permit application form for email address and they've elected not to fill it in, it's not complete. And whoever at intake is accepting that application needs to contact the applicant and let them know that their application will not be considered complete unless they've provided the information we require in order to review and process and work with them to get their applications reviewed by the boards. And it shouldn't be something that Frank, the building inspector, or the planning, you know, department is Googling the name of an address of a restaurant to find the phone number, to call them, to ask them to send an email address that we can send, you know, documents to. So that should be done right. And that's something, you know, whoever is charged with and responsible for receiving the applications needs to be doing. And if they're not, because of other, you know, workflow, I don't know what, you know, individuals' workflows are, someone needs to be managing that process. So I'm just going to quickly share this flow chart. Do you guys see that? It's a little bit tiny. I'll have to zoom in, but this is really the proposed intake would be, so occasionally we do have for complex applications, these like pre-submission conference calls with the building inspector and the planning staff to discuss what it is that they would need to do to apply, depending on what they're proposing. And then at that point, the building department staff, you know, or the applicant submits their application and staff are picking it up from the drop box outside. They're receiving it via mail, via FedEx. And the person who's receiving that needs to be trained or informed or know where it needs to go and what the difference between regular mail, like, you know, the subscription to Planners Weekly, versus an applicant who says, I know I need to go to the Board of Architectural Review. I definitely meet the zoning requirements, no zoning review required. Amber, please put me on the next agenda. Here's my application. Someone in the building department needs to be vetting that and ensuring that in fact they do meet, you know, compliance before it gets, you know, onto a board agenda. And in that case, applicants should be contacted at that stage if anything is, you know, in a base level administrative fashion missing from the application. And, you know, if the applicant is not the property owner, do they have the property owner's signature? These kinds of things. So, you know, so that they are informed. The applications are then entered into, as I understand it, Municity. I'm not sure who specifically does that. I know several I know Barbara does that. I know Kathy may do that. I'm not sure. But at that stage, is that a stage where someone can be looking for that information if they don't have the correct contact information, et cetera? I also understand that at that stage, the checks are processed. So if they have not paid the appropriate fees, what is the appropriate fee? What other fees do they need to be paying? And how am I getting informed at the stage that it needs to go to the various boards when it's referred by Frank? How am I getting informed that they have not, in fact, that they established an escrow account, or they do have already an escrow account? They have, paid their application fee, but for the building permit, but they have not paid their application fee for the land use. So that would be for just the building permit fee, unless it's an application for land use. And then applications are signed to building department staff, as I understand it, for plan review. At that point, they might, ask for updated materials saying, this doesn't meet compliance. You'll need to provide new drawings. That's my understanding. And at that stage, it would then go to finally the building inspector to issue the denial letter referencing or referring rather the application to the land use boards that are required. So at this intake meeting that we've started to hold between the building department and the planning department, working with our consultant, we're determining what board review is required so that we can notify the applicant at that stage so that they're not going forward to a board thinking that they only need the one, and then finding out later that they actually need to go back to the planning board after already having gone to the Board of Architectural Review. These are pretty straightforward, but it is a process that, as you can see, is fairly delicate in the need to be managed by someone and Frank is doing a lot of work that doesn't need to necessarily include the more administrative aspects of typing out the applicant's contact information, for example, or typing out the sheet that notifies them of where they need to go from here. Frank is making that determination, but he doesn't necessarily need to type out the letter. And it's not something that I think the planning department has the capacity for on a regular basis. If so, we need to determine who's doing that and how the applicants are getting informed of where they need to go from there. And so at that stage, it then is referred to the land use boards. And then, we're informing the applicants of what escrow amount they need to pay in order to continue working with the consultants. So this is really just high level, but please let me know if you have any questions there.
It's also important to note that not all applications go before boards. There's a lot of garden variety applications that come in for kitchens or bathrooms or decks, that meet zoning, and it's just a plan review and a building permit, hopefully, if they comply. So I don't know what the percentage is of, ones that need board review as opposed to garden variety ones, but there's many, many more applications than the ones that just go before the boards.
Right.
That is a very good point. And this timeline is merely for the ones that I deal with and my understanding of the process as they are getting to me for those that do require further board approval. And so that's, that might look different, but it should, essentially, we don't know which it is at the time it's in the Dropbox to the time it gets to the offices, let's say.
Right.
Just one quick item. I know that Frank and Amber do have planning board tonight. So that's ours at 7. So I don't want to maybe go to some more of the budgetary items so we don't keep them here past their bedtime.
But before they leave, if I might, walk me through what happens when somebody picks up something in the Dropbox tonight. Tell me what I understand. I understand the organizational chart of what you've shown of what you would like to change things to, I'd like to know what happens today.
So the things that come up from the box go on the front counter, and between Matt or Kathy, depending on who's working that day, they'll enter it into our system and put checks, any checks that go into a safe in the office, and they make up folders for each application. Then it'll go to either myself or Dennis or even Kevin for review to see if it needs to go to any boards. If it does have to go to a board, I'll make a determination letter and I'll give it to Amber at that point. Hopefully he'll have all the information that she needs to, take it from there as far as dealing with the applicants and which boards that I've determined they have to go to, whether it be zoning, BAR, planning, HCZM, whatever it is.
What we're trying to achieve through the intake meeting is to make sure everyone is on the same page. If there is something particularly interesting about a specific application, or it raises a specific question, we're able to work together to make sure we're all on the same page, understand what the right hand doing and what the left hand needs to do. Can you bring up the budget for the building department? We'll go through that real quick.
Absolutely.
I'd like to have a couple of questions before both Frank and Amber disappear. And so I don't mean to delay things, but if they're going to be here, we can't ask the question.
Yeah.
Many of municipalities have moved to electronic only. They started doing this before the pandemic, and they are now doing that 100% in the pandemic. At the end, when everybody wants to have signed plans. At the end of the process, if that is needed by a municipality, they bring it in. In the city of New Rochelle, they don't do that at all anymore. It's all electronic. Everything is communicated electronic. You file things electronic. It's rare that you actually get to talk in person with the building department or the planning department, till you're way into the meetings. And that saves a lot of time. Is there a reason we don't want to do that, or are we doing that or not?
Building department should have hard copies of plans. That's how we usually take them into the building department. Hard copies that are stamped. That one stamped plan goes in the field. So when an inspector goes out to make whatever inspection he's making, he has the right plan that he can look at to see whether they followed the plan that was applied for and approved.
I understand that.
Not as easy.
But you're talking about at the end of the process.
You're talking about the application process.
Right.
Yes, when you get your final approval.
Right. Okay. So what are you suggesting, that we only take it in electronically up front? Yeah, because particularly for the land use boards, there are numerous revisions, et cetera. They come in, we may need to raise the application fee to print things if you want to print them in the office to make it depends on how people work. But it seems to me that solves a tremendous amount of paperwork and can move things a lot faster. If I can understand, Frank, that you would like a signed copy, although today people can sign things and you don't know whether it's signed, or photocopy, but that's neither here nor there. But let's assume that we do that. You do that at the end, but we get there. Even for simple renovations of a bathroom, you may have iterations of drawings.
I would just interject and note that right as of now, I've just recently drafted language for the website that was approved that outlines and explains the process to applicants in an effort to mitigate some of the inquiries that we are getting. As I understand it, the building department is, since COVID requiring, since last March, let's say, requiring 2 sets of hard copies, one for the building department to retain for records, one to stamp and issue back to the applicant, and 1 electronic copy on a flash drive. Now, if some people are submitting materials also by email. I've just worked with our IT to get a new email account set up, applications@vomny.org, which goes directly to me, so I can check it and we can add other people. For instance, Barbara, we can give her access so that she can check it in my absence, or whoever. I think the idea for me is that it's really imperative that we have an electronic copy up front, so that let's say, so that I can share it with the planning consultant before we have our intake meeting, so that she has an opportunity to actually review the document. And for our processing and sort of maintenance of the status of the application, not just for the record, for longevity that goes into Municity, but for, let's say, if I get an inquiry or an email or a call about an application, I can look up what is it, where does it need to go, et cetera, quite easily. And that right now is really, in the way I understand everyone's operating, is really in the hard copy application. And so if I'm not physically in the office, I can't see it. I can't go get the hard copy off application, but even if I can't easily share it with our consultants. And so it'd be ideal if that was really remote, even if we do have hard copies in the office for people to view plans, you know, if they want to come in and say, I'm going to review all the plans today, so with the hard copy, that's one thing, but there should be an electronic equivalent so that anyone can do that as well electronically, and so that the information is all maintained electronically.
Okay.
I think there should be both.
Yep.
All right, Dan Natchez, if you don't mind, I think we need to get through these last pages of the budget. This is more a discussion, you know, kind of a philosophical discussion about.
No, I know, but I just wanted their input
Yeah,
before
I
we.
appreciate that. Thank you.
I also want to reserve a couple questions for Amber's presentation.
Of course,
Maybe we can come back to the end,
but
because it actually ties, and I know it's a larger conversation, Kelly's probably right, with actually the Municity, what is it doing now? What can it do? But and just very focused, very contained, because today is really about the budget. But I do have questions, and
I know we'd love to have them here more. So let's just.
But one also thing on the village calendar, it says cancel planning board. So I
Yes,
think
that was canceled tonight.
Oh, it was canceled. Oh, okay, so it's just canceled today.
so,
I thought-
so
okay.
we're not going to hold you here for a long time. We're going to have dinner, but
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was canceled.
but I
Yeah.
just saw it on the so we have a bit of time.
But I don't think it's anyone's intention that this go past 7.
So,
But
Dan,
let's go through this and go back
Yeah,
to.
let's go to the cuts. Let's go to, because, you know, the water utility, electric utility, that's the.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the first budget is 1620. That's just the
Yeah.
the physical building, what we need, you know, to run, actually have that building. So
Yeah.
it's pretty straightforward. Can you go to the next page,
Please.
Augie? Then we went to the we started on this page. You know, Jerry, you know, as far as the cuts, what we did last year is rather than replacing a full-time assistant building inspector and a full-time code enforcement officer, we made those part-time, and we've been able to, for the most part, meet our needs as far as the inspection.
We have 2 great part-time employees. I want to add, we have 2 great part-time employees.
Yeah.
They're probably great firefighters as well, but they're excellent with us. I think Frank would agree, right?
They're not members of the Village of Mamaroneck Fire Department, so we can't say.
Does the old inspector get removed?
Well, that'll be next year. Anything that's showing in the adopted 21 budget remains until it falls off the budget.
Okay.
So this is just it's a vestige of the way the system prints the budget.
Correct.
So, you know, we talked about the reduction in the staff overtime. We've been very, you know, able to manage it very well. Can you go to the next page, Augie? Okay, you know, it's mostly flat. I mean, there were reductions in equipment and uniforms. Hopefully, if we, staff remains, and we won't need to buy, new uniforms for everyone every year, new shirts and things like that. So that's the overall 10% reduction in those items. Next page, Augie. The schools and seminars for certification. That's always an ongoing item for the department. The new building code just came out in 2020. So, there's been a lot of work at the staff level to familiarize themselves with the new building code. Also with everything going virtual, there's a lot less need to travel for some of these items.
Right.
Let's see, supply increase in office supplies, but I mean, it's a minimal increase. Next page, Augie, please. Then just as your regular items, process serving fees, cell phones and tablets, the staff each have a cell phone and a tablet for their mobile operating systems. We have software maintenance, that's for the existing Municity, the large copier. One of the things, we may have some opportunities this year, we're actually up on our lease, so we're going to start the process of looking at new copiers and that stuff for next year. That's pretty much the overall budget. As you'll note, there is a 12.9% reduction, but as Jerry noted, we are looking to bring on the senior office assistant. Overall, it's about a $130,000 decrease year to year. Even if you bring on a senior office assistant, there still will be a year-to-year reduction in the adopted to tentative budget.
Dan, we should talk about, or Frank should talk about a little bit for just a few seconds of the work that Rebecca has been doing.
Sorry, but before that, I need to reconcile these numbers, these totals with what I have, but what I was giving, because my numbers are different. I actually, my totals are 604.
Yeah, mine too.
Well, it's the building department's 604. That I believe
it says total department
604,125.
604 is different.
Grand total. I think that's including the 689 includes the money in the 1620 budget line.
So
is that correct, Augie?
What we were given doesn't have a grand total. Doesn't have that second line in the bottom.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah, Augie, can you go back to the 1620 budget? I'm assuming it's going to be somewhere around $85,000 total.
So you're combining those two? Okay. That could be an answer.
If Augie can head
Dan,
back
if you look where my mouse is, that's where the 604 is. That's what Victor's looking at. 604, 125.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, is the 689 inclusive of the 1620 budget?
That is correct, sir.
Okay.
So is this 689 inclusive of all salaries?
Yes, and that's inclusive of the money. What I mentioned at the beginning is that there are two budget lines, 1620, which is the building, the what it costs to own and operate the building on an annual basis, and 3620, which is the building department.
Can I just,
Okay.
so for 1620, that includes operating it for the court and the police department as well, right? It's not just the.
That's correct. Yeah, we don't break down the
cost
costs like
of
that.
the building. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
that makes sense.
So but in a typical budget, you would not have them added up. You would have the total for 2630, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you
correct.
don't have that. Yep.
Okay,
Um,
clear. Please go
So
back to what you wanted to explain, Jerry. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No problem, Victor. No problem at all.
Okay,
Rebecca and the work that she's been doing for you, Frank.
Yeah, actually, that kind of goes hand in hand with the court. If you remember, the court talked about the plea by mail system that they've instituted. At the when the court first discussed that with me, I want to say maybe mid-year or August, September last year. I brought the idea up to Jerry, and we thought it was a good idea. But we needed someone to basically the village prosecutor, Mr. Cherico, it puts everything together for the plea by mail. He just needed someone to actually print and stuff the envelopes and do the mailing, and need that person for I think about 4 to 6 hours a week. Understanding the backlog of scanning we needed to get done, I suggested that we bring someone on to try and kill two birds with one stone, someone to help us catch up on the scanning in the building department, as well as assist Mr. Cherico and the court with the plea by mail program. And Rebecca is a temp employee that we were able to secure, and I've heard nothing but good things about her. Frank, is that an accurate statement?
That is absolutely accurate. She's been terrific. Just keeps her nose to the grindstone, does her work, doesn't cause any commotion in the office at all. She's a terrific worker.
Yeah. So it's really allowed us to, again, give the court the help they need, while also taking care of some administrative items in the building department.
So Matt's no longer doing the scanning? He was scanning a lot in the beginning when he first came.
Yeah, well, if you recall, Matt was originally hired as a office assistant in the manager's office. Yep. And one of the projects I had him start on was scanning our files in the manager's office, because I like to make the clerk treasurer happy and have our files scanned into Laserfiche. We were able to get about 30 to 40% done with that before we realized his talents would be better served in the building department. So it's still a goal to get it done, but there are a lot of goals right now.
I can share with you, Matt specifically, I can share with you some of his work from home emails, because the staff is required to send me at the end of the day what they've done if they're working from home. And I'll share some of those work from home emails with the board to show you that Matt is a very talented building department employee.
Does anyone have questions about the budget before I go to the budget committee? Any board members? Okie doke. Glenn has his hand up.
Glenn.
Hello, Glenn.
Hello, good evening. Very quickly, just so we're on the same page. So we have reduced staff by one building inspector. We're not replacing that position, but we're looking to take on a senior office assistant in the building department. Am I correct?
That is correct. That's what we're thinking.
And the second one I have is in Amber's department. And by the way, God bless Amber. You do a terrific job. I know it's both planning and Board of Appeals, so there's a lot of work there. That department has been reduced down to just 2 people. Is that enough for the planning and the Boarding of Appeals, or are we looking to put anybody else in that department?
So Glenn, we changed the model on that. We went with a consulting planner. So the consulting planner now does what the former director of planning used to do.
Where is the consultant planner salary listed?
Contract services, and we'll get up to. We'll ask Augie in a minute to pull up planning.
What did you say? Is that contract services?
Yeah, contract services. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
80-2004.
Okay. Trustees, do you have questions, for our building department folks that, touch on the budget?
I think there's another.
Deputy Mayor Len Aubrey has his hand up.
Oh, excuse me, Len, I didn't see your hand.
Quite all right, Joe.
Go ahead, you're up.
Len is muted.
He has to unmute himself.
Unmute my audio with alternate A.
We can hear you now.
Well, now it looks like he's muted again.
Oh.
Hey, Len, we can't hear you. It looks like you're muted.
I just sent him a message.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
he's good.
Okay.
There we go.
Are we trying to get me?
No,
No.
Len.
Yeah, that's what the problem is.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're okay now, right?
We are.
Okay. We do have consulting planners, but just the question I have is to applicants for consultants hired by the village, applicants pay for the costs of those consultants. I don't know if we don't charge people or applicants for staff, especially for larger projects, to the best of my knowledge, but I wonder if it's possible to charge applicants for a proportionate share of the consulting planners. That's my question.
Yeah. In my experience, those kinds of costs, Len, are typically in the application fees. That's how we get recovery of staff time.
No.
Dan, have you ever heard of anything like that in other munis?
Well, I thought we we adopted a local law about, I think this is at the land use board level of being able to charge back staff time. Is Len talking about those types of applications or the use of the planning consultants prior to getting to a land use board?
I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, of course, I'm trying to think mostly of the land use boards. Since
Yeah.
I think those are the ones where we use consultants perhaps on more than in other cases, let's say more standard projects that might not even come to the land use boards.
So, I mean, as far as the land use boards, there are escrows. For meetings, I think we've talked about internally about, maybe getting an escrow program set up for something like a pre-application meeting. I think we've done that in a couple of occasions, but it is something we've looked at. I don't know if we've brought an official proposal to the board yet, but your ideas are aligned with the staff's ideas.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Actually, Dan, remember the chapter? What is the chapter?
Planning is 80/20. You're talking about planning?
No, for the escrows.
Oh, there is no chapter for the escrows. The escrows are done
Please.
through trust accounts. So
There's a section of the code that allows that, the one that we.
Oh, I'm
changed.
sorry, the village code.
180.
Hold on.
It escapes me. I don't know. I recall something being adopted. I honestly cannot remember which section of the code it is. It's either in zoning. It would either be 326.
No, it's a separate.
It's separate, yeah.
We can look this up and follow up
No.
tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
No, the problem, I think it's timely, because the answer is, I was on the board when this was passed 3 years ago. And the answer to Len, and you can review, of course, this with the attorney and Dan and Jerry, but the answer in my head is absolutely yes. Yes, when the application is sent to the reviewing consultant, that can be escrowed. It's I think it's perfectly clear in my head.
Yeah,
So we haven't but only for land use applications as defined in the code. So it's for those that typically go to the planning board, not to the small ones.
Yeah, but I think it was also more a question of the pre-application process that Len was asking about. So if
Len was asking if we could escrow or pay the consultant from those fees. I think the answer is yes.
oh yeah, I agree with that. I may have interpreted the question differently.
No, but in
Yeah.
review of the application,
So
the
we
answer
could
is
recoup,
yes.
part of that fee.
Yeah.
And you should be starting implementing that
It-
at the earliest now.
It's
said,
it's 176.
I said, I thought the question was about a pre-application process before anything was submitted. If we're meeting with
No.
someone, that wasn't the question, Len?
Yeah, no, I wasn't really
Okay.
talking about the pre-application,
Oh,
no.
okay, I'm sorry, I was,
That's okay.
I misinterpreted it.
Okay, anybody else? All right, Nora, I don't want to forget your bench.
Oh,
I had a question.
I don't want to leave this, just, I have one more question if I can.
Sure, go ahead, Dan.
Okay. Jerry, in your proposed approach,
Yes.
with an additional person
Yes.
flow chart, why do you think that, or how do you think that is going to work different than what has had when we've had additional people in the planning department doing that? We had somebody that was specifically doing that for in the planning department on the applications.
When Betty Ann was there, what she did principally is what Amber does for us now. Amber is a setup artist. She makes sure everything is set up properly.
So the applications are getting to me after they have already been reviewed by the building inspector. So the building inspector needs to determine whether it needs to go to any additional land use boards and which boards. He's reviewing the applications, the plans, and citing the code. And at that stage as well, he's determining, and in the intake meeting, we're discussing what type of project it is, whether it's a major or a minor site plan approval based on the definition that we have for the fee schedule for the escrow amounts. So everything that I outlined in the flow chart is what happens before I even see it, or what should be happening before, what is happening before I see it. And the problem right now is that there are things getting to me that are sort of skipping over some of those items. And as I understand it, the proposed staff person would manage that process of the flow of the application to ensure that it's hitting each point that is needed, so that when it gets to me, I can now switch over to that application, walking them through what they need to do for going for the land use boards, the Harbor Coastal Commission, the planning board, the zoning board, and the Board of Architectural Review. Sometimes all four, sometimes just one. But a lot of work needs to take place before it gets there. And I don't think that Frank should be the only person doing all of the work for each of those applications, especially in regard to more administrative work that is necessary.
Right, it does free up the building inspector.
I would agree with you, Amber. It's not a good use of your time or Frank's time, or Dennis's time to be doing that.
Right.
What I am confused on is, and we work in numerous municipalities, when the municipalities where it works the best is there is a meaningful checklist, and I'll use meaningful because I'm not sure our checklists are really covering everything that we need. But so when the application comes in, let's take the city of Rye, for instance. There are two people that handle all of planning and all of building and all of engineering applications that come in. They go through that, and they go, they used to when you could get to the desk, you could go in and make an appointment and they would go through it with you. But now that you can't get in there, they just do it, whatever. It's required to be filed electronically. And if they don't meet what is necessary, which is what we're trying to get somebody now to do, it is rejected. It's sent back to them and said, here's what you're missing. On a first go through the other, please go back. Here's a checklist. Make sure that you've complied with everything and get it to us. And then you can resubmit it. I'm concerned that we have somebody logging them in and doing an initial quick review and handling whatever checks come in, and then having somebody go through it again, and then getting to a conference meeting. It seems to me that we could simplify the process a bit and make it more efficient. I think the people in the building department do a great job and are very knowledgeable. I just don't know that we have created, and I did at one point create a very detailed checklist for every land use board and gave it to them. That's a while back.
Right. I think what we're describing here is a checklist before we know it needs to go to a land use board. So there are checklists for the land use boards, which may need revisiting, et cetera, as you've described. But that's when that's in my court.
I'm suggesting, Amber, that the checklists go, you can have, the checklists are very extensive that they go through to determine whether or not it has to go in a pile for somebody else to review, or whether it goes into, for a bathroom or the plumbing permit or whomever.
Gotcha.
Type of thing.
Okay.
I do know that when we had somebody who was doing that, there was a significant number of applications that would get to the land use boards or get into the building department review, where there were significant materials that were not there, that should have been there and should have been caught earlier.
Yeah, Amber, I do think that the flow chart is going to help significantly. And I think that having the senior assistant, on staff will address this. I really do. I do see that.
I just have Kelly, I have a question. So just is that okay?
Yeah.
So we did this report, and Amber, I assume you've seen it, but maybe not. It was called the Matrix report.
I'm not familiar.
Okay, so and it was basically about how we could achieve efficiencies in the building department and the planning department. And so a lot of so you didn't even need to read the report to figure out what it said. You guys have figured this out. And I guess what I'm saying is it hasn't been perfect, but it's gotten to be a lot less good without Betty Ann. Like that we're missing that staff person. So I know that we're lower in staff now in the planning department. And she was in the planning department, but if we can have some, and planning and building clearly work together. I mean, that's, you two work well together. So what we need is someone who can just be the initial gatekeeper and make sure that the applications are complete, even if subsequently you're going to have to ask for more information for a specific board.
Yes, I think we're talking about two levels of completeness. One is at initial intake that they've submitted with appropriate contact information and with an electronic submission on a flash drive. Two is the level after, it's been sent to, needs further review, is the checklist where I'm looking at, they've not included a site plan, or, their survey is too old, or whatever it is. They're applying for a sign, permit for the Board of Architectural Review, but they haven't include color photos that are labeled of the surrounding area. These are the things that I'm checking for in terms of completeness. So yes, it might get to me and I need to ask them for additional things, but at that stage, I should be able to just send an email or call up the applicant. And if that information is missing, or if I'm reviewing their stuff and saying it's complete, great, and they haven't paid their fees, I need to know that at that stage before it gets to me, that needs to be looked into and determined, and or a note signifying, you know, what they need to pay or what they owe or whatever it is. Somehow it needs to be, perhaps it needs to be built in another way into this process. But I would simply say that Betty Ann, while it sounds like she was wonderful, was an individual, and the process should be in place in an efficient way so that anyone can come in and take over that individual's place and the process still functions.
Yeah.
And I think the idea here is to have someone heavily involved in that process on the building department end so that they can manage that process and so that they can enforce some of the like harder decisions where we have to tell an applicant, no, you cannot, no, we're not going to just hand this to Amber and then come back a week later and say, hey, Amber, they finally submitted this document and that document and that document. And 2 days before the meeting, I'm scrambling to find, you know, more documents, and it wasn't complete to begin with. You know, it should be complete by the submission deadline or they're not going forward. And we need to be firm in that. Otherwise, these things come back and not just hurt us, but really, you know, hurt the applicant if they're going to lengthen their process by, you know.
We also have two identified areas of complaints that are generated. It's the responsiveness on the phone and the fact that the staff is too busy to deal with the phones. And Frank had a pretty good solution where we would start phones at, what was it, Frank, 10 a.m. and then stop phones at 4 a.m. so that the staff could, or the office assistants could.
That's a lot of overtime, Jerry.
Yeah,
4 p.m. 4 p.m.
Yeah. 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Let's use that. And then in addition to that, our staff, which are just 2 people, they have to prepare bank statements.
Mhm.
They have to bank deposits. They have to prepare payroll, identifying timekeeping, because they're one of the 2 of them have to be the timekeeper for everyone up there. And in addition to that, there's the other source of complaint, which is that there's not enough follow-up. For instance, we have a committee for the environment member who I think submitted a pool application in November, emailed me last week. I tried to help her, and then I guess it was determined that either it was never received or the staff upstairs never got it, so she had to resubmit. But either she called many times and didn't get anyone to pick up the phone, or she forgot about it. But the reality is, you know me, I'm focused on the delivery of services. And if we can improve the delivery of services, that's what I'm trying to do. Now that we have a little bit of space in the budget line, I want to try to resolve and improve on some issues. That's what I'm trying to do right now.
And I would agree that there's a lot of time where land use boards can't make a decision because they haven't gotten the right information. So
Yeah.
like that's, you know, getting the checklists all the way through are important. The other thing I've been thinking about is I completely support the requirement for an electronic application because it makes it much easier for staff to get it up on the website. But when we go back to meeting in person, the land use board members are going to need paper or a screen at the dais. And that's going to be like an expense we're going to have to figure out. Either we're going to have to charge the applicant or make the applicant do those 14 copies again or whatever, or figure out how we're going to pay for some sort of a computer system at the dais so it's paperless.
Yeah, we would have to outsource the copying because we couldn't do it. It's too voluminous, but we'd have to somehow charge the applicant for those copies.
Right. So I don't know. I just mean, you know, we're not going to be in person, but I don't know that anybody can use like a laptop to look at all those plans. It's really hard. You want a bigger screen so you can see things. So that's just like, you know, and the optimistic time we're all meeting together in person and the land use boards are meeting in the
It's
courtroom.
May 17th. I have that date, May 17th.
Yeah.
No.
Any other? Okay. Any other trustee questions? I want to get to Glenn. I know he has a quick follow-up budget question for us before we get to the bench.
Yes, I had the question.
Sure.
To follow up on the chart.
Yep.
I believe it gets to you like in the fourth it would be good to have it on the screen, but my question is, who's doing first? I think the first two are the review of the application. The third one is when Frank looks at it, and the fourth is the intake. So
Can we
my
drop-
question is, who's doing 1 and 2 now when it's in your court? I understand there are many other permits that are building department, but when it goes to the to the boards, who's doing number 1 and number 2?
Amber, can you put your screen back up? We'll drop off on the budget.
It says you cannot screen share. Oh, there we go.
We'll get you there.
Okay. 1 second.
And also, before I forget, maybe if Jerry authorizes, maybe you can share that with us. It sounds very useful. And it's very small. I cannot read it. I mean,
Yeah,
she gives
it was
me,
tough to fit it all.
but if you could share it with us, it's helpful. So who's doing the first?
Okay, sorry, I am having some navigation issues. Okay, so it's starting here at intake. So,
Yes.
so,
Who's
so,
doing it now?
That's good.
I think that's a Frank question. As I understand it, it's either Kathy and or Matt.
Okay,
That's correct.
okay.
Okay.
Is that correct? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's correct. Yes.
Okay, so Kathy and not Barbara. No, Barbara is not involved there.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, number 2, if it goes to the boards, are you entering it into Municity now?
I am not, I understand that Barbara is entering them into Municity.
Okay, so those applications, let's say for a site plan, do get inputted in the Municity?
I understand that they do.
Yep.
How about
Barbara tells me that most
Frank?
applications go to her where she enters them into Municity and processes the application fee.
Okay, then third, the next one is Frank.
That's
Well,
right.
actually, I think that's like Dennis. I don't know if there's anyone, I don't know if Tom is doing that. I don't know.
Then it's Frank,
Then it's Frank.
then it's you, as
Then-
part of that,
it's,
and then you
the
continue.
intake meeting between Frank, AKRF and me.
Okay.
We make
Then
Dan
it's
Sono attend those meetings.
Thank you. That'll be helpful,
Yeah.
because I think we can just pick it up there, because I was gonna actually ask, but time is late, about the Municity, because I've been rereading this. I know Dan Natchez brought it in when he was talking with the judges. And as I was reviewing it again, the Municity that has been proposed to us is a section of the Municity that's for integrated parcel management, building permits, and you can add, but it's not very clear here, but there's discussion in the appendix about planning department.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, what would be ideal is if I can just open up Municity and all of the information for that application is in there. It has the applicant, the owner, the contact information, what payments it needs, and what boards it needs to go to. And any updates, any results of that intake meeting are input into Municity, and we can sort of use it as like a tracking thing. As I understand it, it's not quite that seamless a tracking vehicle for these applications. I have access to Municity. It crashes every time I'm not in the office. It frankly crashes frequently when I'm in the office. And I have a hard time searching for documents, searching for just like typing in the address. Half the time it says it doesn't come up. I'm not as equipped as Barbara. Barbara is pretty like fluid with using it. So, you know, we've had a crash course once, but perhaps I'm using it wrong. I don't know, but my take is that it leaves something to be desired.
Yeah.
in terms of-
That's
the
very
current-
helpful, because part of this
Yeah.
overall restructuring or upgrade of the department does require us to, again, look at the software applications. We have an excellent memo from Cliff. But I think that's a work session. Probably
Yes.
Jerry,
Yeah.
Frank,
Yes.
Augie. I
Yeah,
think it's a work session, but we cannot delay that. Really, we're behind the 8 ball. The
Yeah.
digitalization is way out, and we just can't. So we have
Yeah.
to fit it into this year.
I agree, Victor.
So
Yeah.
let's keep that, Jerry, put it on for us as soon as you can.
Yeah, I kind of discussed this with Amber the other day about, moving to the next version of Municity, which is cloud-based. I use the example that, if I was, in California, I'd be better off getting on a plane, flying to New York, taking a cab from Merrimack to the building at 169. I would get the results just as fast as trying to connect remotely. But the moving to a cloud-based system would be a major benefit.
And I would just add that, in my experience using these sort of databases for application tracking, is that there need to be standards for how these things are entered, how they are we spelling out street? Are we putting ST with a period? Are we putting ST without a period? Are we, capitalizing things? Does that matter? Are we putting mount with a period, abbreviations, these kinds of things? Are we spelling out avenue? This all needs to be detailed and written and documented in some sort of standard. And I don't know if that's something that, this individual might be charged with, but someone needs to develop that, and someone needs to as well kind of maintain it and ensure that all staff are trained in how to do that and are aware of how they need to be entering this information. I use very frequently in my work the zoning, the zoning finder, and that is fed and informed largely through Municity. And there are definitely discrepancies in being able to search for applications or for building addresses efficiently to that end.
All right, Glenn
Thank you.
Tippett, quickly, your quick follow-up.
Amber, can you please stop sharing so I have access?
Sure, yes.
Glenn, unmute yourself.
Nora, are you ready to go with that budget or with that?
There you go. Just quickly, can we get before we do a review of the revenues, can we get an update on the revenues and expense report with whatever positions have been added, and a side note for any positions that may be that they're planning to add June 1st for next year, but aren't in the budget? Thank you.
Okay, so if I can ask for clarification, Glenn, that we would share with the budget committee, any additional staff that I am thinking of adding for the June 1st? Is that what you're asking for?
Yeah, like you might not have the senior assistant position filled.
Correct.
Before the budget is done, yet we know you're looking to add that staff position.
I got you.
If you're looking to add anybody to the Parks Department. You've
I
already added a court clerk. So what I'd just like to see is any changes that you've made. The last report I have is from 2/5. I'd like to see the updated report of revenues and expenses, and if there's anything else that's going to be added to the budget that's not in there, aka a senior staff member that's currently not in the budget, just a heads up that eventually it will be in the budget, so we kind of know how the revenues and expenses balance.
So we'll split this responsibility. Augie will give you the latest version, which I think is on March 5th, might be the date, right? And then I'll give you what some of my operational thoughts are. I'll give it to the board and the budget committee simultaneously.
Thank you. I much appreciate it.
Thank you.
So essentially that discussion of new positions, etc., it will be picked up on the 20 is it next? When?
24, I think.
24th.
No,
24th.
revenue 24.
Okay, we'll pick it up the 24th. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So at our last work session, we tried to talk about a bench that we want to dedicate and the Arts Council is involved in, but we did not have the final paperwork available on Monday night. So Nora, I think you'd like to amend our agenda tonight to deal with that.
Can we add do we have to add a motion to amend the agenda?
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to propose adding in a motion to amend the agenda to add, I don't know what item number it is.
I think it will be 2.
The next one available, I'll number it for you.
Okay, Anybody
Um,
else?
I'll second.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That was unanimous aye, Victor? Yes, aye?
And then I'd like to add a motion to approve or accept the donation from the Arts Council of a bench in honor of Mary Louise Cox, who was our poet laureate, who sadly passed recently. And this is in honor of Mary Louise and her husband Fred. And it will be a bench across from the library, sort of near Village Hall property, because they were both very involved in the library. And it will have a plaque dedicating to her, and also a plaque with words from one of her poems.
It'll be a lovely thing. And I just want to the public who's listening, this is a time sensitive issue because we have an arts event date coming up. And we'd like to do it at that ceremony.
It's the 20th anniversary of Poetry Live, which Mary Louise founded on April 25th. It always takes place at the Emlyn. Again, it will be via Zoom this year because it has to be remote. But the idea is that the bench could be featured as part of this ceremony.
I'll second that motion. Augie, could you call the roll, please?
Trustee Lucas,
Yes.
trustee Wenstrup,
Yes.
trustee Tefor, trustee Natchez,
Yes.
trustee Natchez, trustee Tefor. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Do we have a motion to end the meeting?
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Looks
Thank
like.
Glad
you.
you guys have the evening off.
Amber.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you, Amber.
Thank you.
Bye. Nice to see
Thank
you.
you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
you
Take
all.
care. Bye.
Night.